get another reminder of something that I've believed for a long time, and that is the biggest museum we have sits at the bottom of the sea.
All right, here we are on episode one of Fascinated by Shipwrecks. And I'm super excited to have my dear friend and colleague, James Delgado, joining me today for this inaugural episode. Jim, I am just thrilled to bits that you're here.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here with you. So many of the years of this journey that I've been making have been made, of course, with you. And so I feel we've already shared a lot of shipwreck adventures, but here we go, sharing them in a new way with different folks.
Great. So, if you're a fan of the Sea Hunters or of the Drain the Oceans series on TV, Jim will probably need no introduction. But if you haven't heard of Jim before, I'm just going to read a little bio about him to give you some background. So, Jim has spent over 4 decades in the wonderful underwater realm exploring shipwrecks, and he's written more than 36 books, 200 professional and layperson articles. He has given hundreds of presentations worldwide. He has been the lead archaeologist on two TV series that I mentioned, The Sea Hunters, which was produced by Econova Productions and ran from 2002 to 2006. He was also part of the National Geographic's Drain the Ocean series, which ran from 2018 to 2023, and that's still running in syndication. I know because I've been reviewing some of those wonderful episodes. Jim has also been an integral part of over 150 shipwreck investigations, including the USS Monitor, the USS Independence, the USS Arizona, the buried gold rush ships of San Francisco, the slave ship Clotilda, and of course, the wreck that we're all familiar with, Titanic. So, in today's episode, we're going to be going back to the beginning of the field of maritime archaeology to ask Jim how it all began. So, Jim, without further ado, um,
Thank you.
the basic question I'm going to ask is, what is maritime archaeology?
Maritime archaeology is the study of humanity's interaction with the water, be that the oceans, lakes, rivers, streams. One of the biggest threads in human history is our relationship with the water. It nourished coastal communities, whether from rivers and streams or lakes to the ocean itself. It was the means by which we spread around the planet as a species. We didn't just walk, we sailed. And I believe that that sailing technology developed far past logs that people sat on very quickly. And with that, maritime archaeology looks not just at the ancient past, but also the development of ships over time, the development of sea and lake coast communities. It looks at everything from trade and culture to war at sea, you name it. All of that's wrapped up in maritime archaeology. And the important thing to remember is that for some of us as maritime archaeologists, we may work underwater, but we can also work on a beach. We can work in the middle of a pit, in the middle of a downtown area where land has filled in what had once been ocean. And in some cases, yes, I have also worked way up in the mountains where in some lake there's something that floated that sank.
Wow. So, I understand there's something like 3 million shipwrecks in the ocean that we sort of have estimated. Would you say that's an accurate number, or do you know?
We don't really know. And my sense is, having sat at the table with the guy that came up with that estimate, uh, I think it's probably a little less, maybe a couple of million. And What's a shipwreck? Shipwrecks can be a smaller craft, one of those seafaring canoes, for example, like a Polynesian voyaging canoe. When those sink, most likely not much left on the seabed. And in fact, some of them probably floated until marine organisms ate them. So the majority of marine accidents that happened over time, I think there were less. And where the bulk of shipwrecks come from is literally the last 5 centuries, which is the development of the modern world. That's when big empires are being formed. And of course, earlier, the Romans uh, had their large fleets, and there's thousands of wrecks in the Mediterranean, for example, that are Roman, as well as up and down the coast of Europe and even in Britain. But the bulk of them come from the last 500 years. And with that, I think the largest numbers are associated with World War I and World War II, where thousands, tens of thousands were lost.
Yeah, and that's another point that's important to make is that, as sort of exciting as shipwreck hunting is, they typically mean that someone or many people have passed in the circumstances when a ship has wrecked.
Yes. And you don't ever forget that when you're working on these sites. In some cases, we suspect no one died or no one's remains are left on the vessel. That doesn't mean that you still don't deal with it respectfully and carefully. And as an archaeologist, I understand that shipwrecks mean different things to different people. For some folks, it's a song, it's a piece of art, it's a movie that they've seen that connects them to that story. In other cases, what we're looking at is probably a ship that has meaning to families, families whose loved ones were on that, families whose families sailed on those vessels. And even though no one was on board the ship when it sank, they still hold that as a special memory in their family. So, for a variety of reasons, shipwrecks mean a great deal to many people. And I appreciate and understand that as an archaeologist, my interests, as well as my interests as a historian, don't always reflect their interests. So again, you work respectfully and carefully and mindfully.
And that makes total sense, of course. And I know that there seems to be much more of an allure to the ancient shipwrecks versus, let's say, modern day shipwrecks. Do you find that?
Well, what's interesting is that I worked on ancient shipwrecks, not as much as I have more modern wrecks. The area that I study really starts in the 19th century and continues up to, relatively, recent times. Ancient wrecks, of course, grab some attention. But what I find is the number one wreck people always ask about is Titanic. People, I think, find the idea of a ship at the bottom not only fascinating, but it's an opportunity to reflect on family stories, to reflect on other stories, uh, and to just, I think, get another reminder of something that I've believed for a long time, and that is the biggest museum we have sits at the bottom of the sea.
And you call that the final frontier.
It is a final frontier for us on the planet in regards to exploration, to discovery, to understanding our own past. We've gone into space and we're mapping and exploring. And with that, the Hubble and the Webb and all the other telescopes are revealing much about the secrets of the universe. I'm fascinated by that. But I'm also fascinated by what shipwrecks tell us about our own history, forgotten or unknown stories. And so that final frontier analogy means more than just simply going. The basic premise of good exploration is you got to come back and share what you saw. And
Mhm.
so, with that, yes, I think as robotic vehicles, divers, and others boldly go where none have gone before, it's an apt way to describe what we're doing in the oceans, the lakes, the rivers.
Okay, so going back to the beginning of when the field or the discipline started, and I believe it was Dr. George F. Bass that began adapting land archaeology tools for underwater. Is that correct?
George Bass's excavation of the Gelidonia shipwreck off the coast of Turkey is seen as the beginning of more scientific underwater or nautical or maritime archaeology. Divers had been, of course, working on wrecks before that, famously, guys that were working with Jacques Cousteau. Archaeologists had stood on the boat in 1900 when another ancient wreck was excavated as hard hat divers in the gear went down and raised pieces of statues and other items. Bass was joined by colleagues Joan DePlatte Taylor and Honor Frost, who today are rightly recognized as the co-founders of scientific maritime archaeology. Both had started this work. Honor dived. Joan DePlatte Taylor did not. But the three of them working with other colleagues, Peter Throckmorton, who uh, became an archaeologist. Together, they pioneered this, but they were assisted by the Turkish sponge divers, but also by an amazing fellow, Claude Dutuy, French diver who had just left military service and joined them. And he was actually the one that was able to show George Bass how to dive and how
Hmm.
to go into the water, clear his ears, and get on down there to the job. Uh, that team, and I want to stress team, helped set a new path for all of us. It was George then who took all of that and began to write the studies and the reports, bringing in other scholars, bringing in his own students, and thus began a discipline that today is a very diverse group of maritime, underwater, nautical, shipwreck, and non-shipwreck archaeologists around the globe, women, men, people of different nationalities, and every culture, people of color. Uh, it's it's really blossomed into an amazing part of global archaeology.
I bet it's been fascinating for you to have seen all of those changes over time. Can you say a little bit about, the invention of scuba and how that changed? Like in the early days, everybody was using scuba. Today, there's a lot more different technology on being used now, and not so much diving. I guess it depends on the type of shipwreck, the depth of the shipwreck, and what the teams are trying to achieve.
Well, people going underwater goes back a long time. Diving bells, just like taking a cup and holding it upside down and putting it into a sink full of water. That was the way that people accessed shipwrecks hundreds of years ago. And in fact, the person supposedly to use a diving bell was Alexander the Great. But suits that enabled you to dive, usually sealed suits, helmets that you would wear, those are more an invention that was perfected in the 19th century, particularly with the invention of the standard dresser, the big helmets that today we associate with historic diving. Those date to the 1830s and 1840s. And by the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, and up to today, we still use them. Those helmets defined diving. Scuba is more an invention that comes about with the idea of being on your own, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Scuba, invented by Émile Gagnon and Jacques Cousteau at, during World War II, caught on with tremendous popularity starting in the 1950s, but particularly blossomed in the 1960s. When I learned to dive and was trained to dive in 1978, it was still scuba. Um, and the gear that we had then, a little simpler than what we have now. The certification standards were still pretty rigorous. I ended up going to dive class at the Presidio of San Francisco, where Master Sergeant Dutch Bowen taught us that there was a right way, a wrong way, and the Army way to dive. I wasn't in the Army, I was in the National Park Service. But that approach to diving, I think ultimately saved me more than once in a tight situation. But coming back to it, diving certainly has evolved. What we didn't know then was the cumulative effects of diving, even when you were decompressing and getting that
Mhm.
gas formed when, well, all the nitrogen in your blood gets compressed when you're under pressure. If you come up too fast and the pressure is relieved, uh, once you've gotten up after 100 or even a couple hundred feet, if you don't come up slowly and let that gas dissolve back into your blood, um, it forms bubbles. It's like taking a bottle of soda, shaking it up on a hot day, and then popping it open. That's your blood. That's what it does inside your body. And so it can cripple or kill you.
Mhm.
So with that, we were all mindful of that. What we've learned now is that it's better to not just use regular air. So mixed gas diving, gas that replaces some of the nitrogen. That's one part of it, as well as rebreathers that allow you to recycle your air and enable you to stay longer. They all still have their risks. Diving remains part of what we all do, but increasingly, what we're seeing is that robotics also play a role. And at this stage, you know, going on to 5 decades since I learned to dive, I really don't scuba anymore. Most of my dives now are done, if I can't snorkel it, it's done particularly with the deep water wrecks, it's done with robotics, with cameras on systems that go down. And to that end, none of us is going to be diving at 15,000 feet, which is where we were not too long ago, working off of Hawaii at the Battle of Midway, or even, 3,500 feet deep when we were working just a little while ago on the wreck of that destroyer, the USS Stewart.
Yes, so diving has inherent dangers, no matter what decade you were diving in. I guess the technology of scuba changed, like you said, but it still has those precarious things that divers have to watch out for. Of course, everybody, I assume, on these um, wreck dives know what they're doing, but the odd time there is an accident.
There are unfortunately still dive accidents, and even with some of us who are the most experienced, as Master Sergeant Bowen used to say, there's old divers, there's bold divers, there's no old bold divers. So you take it carefully. What
Yeah.
I've seen happen is that for people that get into that intermediate stage when they feel more confidence, that's when accidents can happen. It can also happen when you get to be an older diver like myself and you make the mistake of thinking you can still do what you did at 29. At 67, I know better.
So I just want to conclude by sort of touching on Titanic because I can't not talk about that with you. You've been involved with that shipwreck for a number of years.
Titanic is a ship that the moment it sank, society couldn't just let go of. It was the disaster of the century. Other ships have sunk since, but Titanic remains, I think, in part because of it being the world's first modern media disaster. It was the equivalent of breaking news when it happened, thanks to the wireless transmissions being intercepted. Titanic's rediscovery, after years of people writing about it and thinking about it, and the subsequent missions certainly have ingrained Titanic into the modern consciousness, whether it was Bob Ballard's team working and discovering it, to the subsequent dives, the recoveries of artifacts from it, to films like the IMAX movie or powerfully Jim's movies, not just Titanic, but Ghosts of the Abyss, which I think does a magnificent job in making you remember exactly what that ship is when you encounter it at the bottom of the sea. In that eternal darkness, having dived it, you drift over those decks and you have a very powerful sense of knowing exactly where you are because it's so well documented. But with that, it's almost as if in your mind's eye you can see what transpired on those decks. And that's what Jim's film does in Ghosts of the Abyss. It takes that ghost town and repopulates it with scenes from his movie. And that's just incredible. Any of us who dive, any of us who explore the past do imagine at times. Not imagine that you see something, but imagine what it must have been like, what it was when this ship was on the surface. So to that end, yes, Titanic. In 2010, we did do a complete mapping of the entire wreck site, working with RMS Titanic, the National Park Service, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where I had just joined as Director of Maritime Heritage. Those maps really opened up a public perception of Titanic as not just the bow or even the mangled stern, but everything out there, the entire site. This has just been redone magnificently, powerfully by a team that includes some of the folks that we were able to work with in 2010. My friend Evan Kovacs, Dave Gallo, and others have just finished that mission. Again, working with RMS Titanic. It's incredible because Titanic is changing. It is degrading at the bottom of the sea. It's not going to disappear in 50 years. It'll take centuries before it melts into the seabed. But change has happened, and it's certainly different. I saw changes in between 2000 and 2010. Titanic has been in the news, of course, because of the tourism dives and the loss of Titan and the deaths of 5 people, 2 of whom I knew. And so that aside, because Titanic, as I said, is a ship that society doesn't want to let go of. So what's left? What more could we do in terms of our interactions with Titanic? I don't think we should leave it alone. I think missions could go and continue to look at it. And with that, if there's ever to be a mission that is to bring anything back, I don't see the need to recover another statue or another big iconic piece. There's enough of that on display now from the various recovery missions to give everyone who goes to those a sense of Titanic and life on board. It's been the recovery of some of the pieces of luggage, which might make some people cringe. But after over a century, what those pieces of luggage do when they are unpacked in a laboratory and studied and then displayed and kept together in a museum setting for more display is it reflects back on something more than just a big ship and an iceberg. It talks about that ship as a small community that, for the most part, died that night. It talks about the individuals in that community, and it not only talks about them, but it gives you insights into who they are. Franz Pullbaum's trunk, when it was opened and as items are displayed, speak to a German immigrant who made his new life in America in the New York City area, who went back home to see his old friends and his hometown, and then returned. Because he was a worker, because everything he had was basically in a lodging house, his trunk has everything from his work boots and shoes to his tools to his German-English dictionary, as well as his dress-up clothes as a second-class passenger. But what's also powerful is at the very top of that trunk, ready to be seen when inspectors at Ellis Island opened it up, was his declaration of intent, a formal legal document of his intent to become a U.S. citizen, a dream that ended when he drowned on that night in April 1912. Franz Pullbaum's story would not have been known had it not been for that trunk and what it revealed about him. And there are others. So if more was ever to come up, I think it should be something like that. Not to pry into past lives, but to remind us that ultimately what we do as archaeologists on any shipwreck is not so much try to understand how one plank was fastened to another, but what it says about us as humanity and us as individuals.
Very powerful story. I hate to end this, but I have to wrap this episode, Jim. It's just been absolutely thrilling and fantastic to have you here. And I look forward to you joining me on the next episode of Fascinated by Shipwrecks. Thanks, Jim, so much. Bye for now.
Thank you, Kathy. Bye-bye.
Lost in time, the wreckage lies, broken masts and shattered pride. In the deep, the answers hide. Echoes of the past call out, whispers from beneath the waves. What secrets do the shadows keep? Do we dare disturb their sleep? Ooh. secrets to the shadow.